Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. We are here with Rachel Hayden, who had a great Voices with Vervaeke a few weeks ago. Really enjoyed listening to that, and so glad that you're with us today, Rachel.
Thank you, Brett. This is really, well, it was, I guess, kind of humbling to be on Voices with Vervaeke, and then to be on here is additionally humbling. So I really appreciate it and appreciate a chance to meet the community over here.
That's great. Well, maybe you could start off by just introducing yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what your journey's been like, what brought you here, how you came to meet John, and so on.
Yeah, so as I talked about with John a little bit on the on his channel, I've kind of had a twofold, um, I guess, aspirational journey lately. One being gender transition, which I would consider myself kind of smack dab in the middle of. And then the other being this like growing, dawning understanding of this deep-seated need for wisdom. And, that latter aspiration sort of, even while I'm in the middle of the former, it's kind of like overtaking it or surrounding it. So I feel like the gender transition process is sort of has been resituated for me, as John would say, maybe within this larger like aspiration toward what does it mean to be a wise person, to have a meaningful life, to have the types of connection and sensibility that would afford one meaning. And so all that's kind of woven together for me in the last couple of years. Um, and I guess prior to that, my main psychotechnologies were centered around body arts, Tai Chi, karate more recently, um, meditation, typically in the Zen style. That's kind of how I came up, so to speak, and music performance, writing, lyricism, things like that. So I had this loose kit of things that, like many people, were kind of cobbling together some kind of set of psychotechnologies without really understanding the ecological nature of that and not really having a grand narrative for it or anything like that. And realizing, I told John that like there was a moment not too long ago where I was on an airline flight and there was some turbulence, and I just had this flash of like a moment of clarity that if I had died in an airplane crash at that moment, my life would seem meaningless in those last moments. And it was really a jarring, sudden realization. And I had just begun watching his series at that point. So it really deepened my interest. And since then, I've been, following his work and the work of his interlocutors and the books that he's been recommending and all that stuff, and trying to kind of understand how, I guess, especially how aspiration works and how, from the perspective of like Agnes Callard, who a lot of people probably know already, and how a Callardian view fits within a Vervaekean framework, especially, and how that would work for me. So I'm really, I guess scrambling in a way to resituate my transition into that and to just, you know, as probably a lot of people here have experienced, just like realizing the depth of what, you know, we're kind of trying to do when we start to talk about wisdom. It's like a, as the Zen master Dogen talked about, it's like this ocean that gets deeper the farther you step into it. You're like, oh, I can't, if I take a couple steps, it gets exponentially wider and deeper. And where do I even, put the oar in the waters here, so to speak. So I guess that's kind of what's brought me here now. I was on John's channel through a real fluke of luck on my part. I was a Patreon at a certain level, and the Patreon got a little screwed up. They're really busy over there, and they offered me one-on-one talks with John once a month, and I was like, "That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. That's really really generous." So I had my first one-on-one with John. I had a bunch of questions that I'd brought, but I wanted to fill him in on my bio a little bit because it didn't seem fair to just start asking him questions without him having like a context of who I was, where I was coming from. And pretty much immediately he was really struck by my framing of gender transition. It had been, to be honest, I feel like just completely inspired by his work. It wasn't anything that I came up with. but he was really impressed with how I applied it, I guess, in the realm of gender transition. And he kind of thought, well, this is so different than the common viewpoints out there, and these like really sort of limiting, argumentative viewpoints and stances that people are taking on transgender issues. And it would be really great to have you, be on my channel, and we could like open up more of a space for dialogue around it. As he said, there's a kairos at the moment, as with so many things in our society, that he thought it was a great opportunity. So I said, after a little internal debating, I said yes, and it was a great experience, really amazing. Truly an experience of dialogos, where you kind of sense this living intelligence at work in a dialogue, which was really pleasurable in itself. So yeah, tremendous experience. I guess that's what I wanted to say about that. So I think that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, that's great, and I do want to get into it in a bit about how in practice you've gone through your sort of aspirational journey. But first, if we could just talk about the well, first, I mean, to make it simple, what does it mean for someone to be transgender?
Yeah, for me, simply just to have a gender identity that's at odds with the category that society put you into based usually on your biological attributes, external biology in particular.
And I felt it during your talk with John. You spoke about your sort of relationship to the notion of gender and your exploration of that. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've approached this notion, and maybe, and I don't know, but the differences between gender and sex, and how it is sort of out in the public, and how you've approached it?
Sure, yeah. I see, as with a lot of stuff that John talks about, so much equivocation around gender, because we have, people on one side saying, well, a man can never be a woman, and they're speaking from external sex, most likely. They're speaking of like, early history, like your upbringing, that can't be changed, that kind of thing. And then other people are saying, well, this woman was always a woman, they just happen to be misgendered, wrongly based on external attributes. Neurologically, they were always, a woman, or, that kind of thing. So I feel like we're often talking past each other on this issue. And I don't have, after all this time, I have even less of a clear sense of like pinning down gender, as one thing, as hopefully I made it clear in my video with John, because it seemed to get more and more complex the more I looked into it, and there was so much, there's so much equivocation and bullshit around gender. And really, one of the reasons I got into John's work was feeling like I'd been so susceptible to bullshit in earlier, times in my life. And so I didn't want to fall into the same traps with gender. I really wanted to explore it. And I'm seeing it, at this point as really a sense of optimal grip, and a sense of participatory knowing and perspectival knowing in the world, where, if your gender isn't right, there's like this sense of, there's a friction or a collision, like somehow in your participatory knowing there is an opacity that you're bumping up against. And when you kind of realize it for what it is, you're like, oh, this, my gender isn't fitting. Something is wrong here, basically. And you don't necessarily know what it is, because it is so deep, and gender is so transparent to society in so many ways, that it's really hard to get a grip on it at all. To even ascertain, like, okay, what am I? What's going on here? Am I, deluding myself, or, what's the scientific truth of this? What's, the neurobiological level and all that? It was really quite a long investigation on my part, where I was just kind of disappointed with all the views out there, to be honest. Like, even, whatever camp you're talking about, whether it's the, pro or anti or skeptical, or, social constructivist or whatever, group of people out there, it just nothing really held water completely. So for instance, like I talked about, one of those aspects in the video with John, like if gender is just a social construct, then why, I've heard transgender people say this, but then why would you need to transition? What's the deal? Who cares? Just it's a social construct, no big deal. Um, for me, it just felt so much personally deeper than that, and I think a lot of people have a deeper experience likewise. And then on the other hand, like if it's only an internal thing that you're projecting onto the world, based on your maybe neurology or something, then like why do so many societies have different concepts of gender, even numbers of genders, gender roles? Like clearly it's not, if it's only based on neurology, I don't think we'd be seeing this. So I think there's a strong cultural impact that sort of has, some constraints on what gender is. I think it's probably more of a transjective issue than we give it credit for. And yeah, I'm still on the quest to find out the truth there.
It's a complicated issue, and it's become very political. I mean, I've asked myself and I've asked others, and I haven't received a great answer to this. I would have thought if it's purely a social construct, for example, that therapy would work for at least some people to cure gender dysphoria. But from what I understand, gender dysphoria is pretty resistant to therapy. That you can't just talk yourself out of it. Is that
Right.
is that your experience, or have?
Yeah, that was my, encounter with the therapy world was pretty much like they were saying like, this is because you're transgender. They were like which is it's kind of funny because I didn't know what to expect, but they were like, this our treatment for this is to help you transition basically. Um, and I don't think there were any exceptions. I do peer support as a profession, so I know a lot of social workers and mental health professionals that I bump into, and they pretty much, if they have a different view, they don't speak about it much, at least.
And now, I mentioned that transgender issues have become quite political and social and political. They're a big they play a big role in the public space these days. There's lots of debate on all sides. Do you think this relates to the meaning crisis? And if so, how do you think it fits in?
I feel like it does, and I get this sense that gender is in crisis in general. You see it from, leftists, rightists, whatever, like any part of the political spectrum, talking about feminism or Western culture or anything like that. Like gender really comes up constantly, and so transgender issues are necessarily folded into that. And I feel particularly just from my own process, and I talked to John about this too, but like I feel like there is in one camp sort of this romantic projection, this degenerate romanticism that John would talk about, where you just decide what your gender is. It's something you make up, you project it on the world, you come up with a name for it, you come up with pronouns, whatever. The world is meaningless in terms of gender by itself. You just create it all. And I did find that very dissatisfying as someone who appreciates science and some semblance of objective truth. And then there's, the other camp that's just like, we're looking at empirical evidence based on your anatomical structure, your genitalia, your hormones, etc. It even gets into neurobiology there, but, I couldn't relate to the neurobiological aspect of gender either because, I don't experience my neurons sending transmitters directly. I have the experience as a person. So that all of that was really dissatisfying. And I feel like, it ties in those two big threads that John likes to talk about a lot, romanticism and empiricism, clashing over this issue, get bound up in political parties and in different social movements, and I feel like in a way we're kind of a canary in the coal mine. It's not the greatest job to have in the world, but at the same time, I do find it sort of fascinating. I try to stay out of the political fray as much as possible. I've really felt like the thing to do is step back and try to have more rational discussions, more questioning, hopefully more Socratic approaches to things. and not just like tie into like, again, those like simplistic definitions that kind of depend on equivocation, arguing past each other.
Do,
So
do,
that would be my
yeah.
ideal.
Do you have you? I don't know. Have you entered into the fray? Are you on Twitter or Facebook and or social media and arguing with people about this, or have you kept largely to yourself?
I've pretty much kept to myself and like friends on Facebook. I'm very interested in just like trying to show people the journey as it's happening. So I started with, within the first couple months of what's called gender dysphoria, when I started experiencing this sense of that painful, you know, dull sheet metal screeching sense in my soul. Gender dysphoria is a really clinical term, but it doesn't really capture the phenomenology of it, I guess. But pretty quickly I wanted to just show people this is what it's like. This is a human process. This is a human journey. I'm not claiming, hey, you people, I'm trans and deal with it or anything like that. But this is just what I'm going through: confusion, doubt, pain, you know, shame, self-hatred, and then, happier things, self-acceptance, feeling more whole, etc. Gratification from just the sense of like being able to be in contact with greater parts of myself. All of that was like a really human journey for me. And it was happening at the same time as it was becoming a widespread political issue in the United States. So I wanted to just like basically that was my way of entering the fray, was a very personal counterpoint to the culture wars 2.0, as they say. I just did not want to go there and get into some kind of ridiculous, back and forth phrase, especially on social media. So yeah, I avoid Twitter completely. I pretty much avoid, Facebook, except for, specific groups of people, that kind of thing.
So, so you have an aspirational approach to this, and I'd like to get into that. And actually, Mark has asked, would you explain your understanding of aspiration and how you think this is going to help you?
Yeah, for me, aspiration was a really, really great reframing. And this is in the Agnes, Callard sense of aspiration. So, rather than, just picking from a set of options in front of you based on your current values, aspiration involves trying to become a better person in some way. And she used to say in kind of a specific way, and now she's gotten a little more general on that. But it's, and as soon as you do that, you're saying, okay, now I'm becoming a different person. Then you open up this whole paradox that L.A. Paul talked about prior to Callard, where if you're going to make a transformational, a decision to engage in a transformational process in your life, you don't know what you're going to be like. You don't know what your world's going to be like. You're going to have different values. You're going to have a different salience landscape, all that stuff. So you're making yourself inherently vulnerable by doing so, which is a really important point to me, having gone through it, not just because it's a transgender thing, but in general, you're kind of putting yourself in a sense at the mercy of the process, which usually includes, other people like guides or someone who's farther along the way that can kind of give you some advice once in a while. And it involves like becoming someone truly with different values eventually. So I don't see it as like a really linear process or one that's easy to encapsulate. But I do see it as one that really, really, like, I can see why John loves Callard's work so much. It makes total sense to me because it seems very participatory, in its depths, like where, if you're going to become someone with different values, you're depending on that future you to kind of establish your normative values for you now, the future you that literally doesn't exist yet. And so you're opening yourself up into this pretty big unknown. You only have a general sense of where you're headed. And yet it's like one of the most, wonderful things we can do as humans. It's necessary. And I think, understanding it better has also become a real interest of mine along this process, because I'm like, oh, I get it. I can sense this as I'm transitioning, that my values are turning more toward care for others. They're turning more toward care for community, taking, care of things. A lot of caring has come out from it, and not necessarily in the sense of like, oh, now, I'm going to become a woman and then I will be more nurturing, or, something kind of, cardboard cutout like that. Much more like, oh, this is the values that are like coming forth now as I'm aspiring toward it. And it's giving me more of a sense of the direction that I'm headed in. Whereas at first like I said, I think it was very confusing. It's very murky.
Well, that's interesting. Do you think that those changes were related because you said you were going through two aspirations, one your transition, one your wisdom journey. Is it hard to distinguish what came from what? Whether this sense of caring for others is from the transition or from the wisdom transition?
Yeah, very, very much so. It's very hard. I could say with more clarity that there's a certain sense of like wholeness, of freedom, a sense of freedom in my life that came from the transition specifically. Um, Acting, more appropriately, paying better attention to the things of the world and how to care for them. That's a little bit harder for me to disentangle, if I'm being honest. I wouldn't say that I've like made much, forward motion in the wisdom journey or anything. So part of me would say, it's probably more the gender transition. I'm still, I'm still working on that garden of psychotechnologies where I'm, you know, like, oh, would this work? Would this fit? How would this go? And I'm trying to actually incorporate that, incorporate gender transition into my ecology of psychotech as much as I can. And that's an ongoing process as well. So yeah, at a certain point, the border really breaks down.
So I'd like to ask you a little bit about how this all worked in practice. So in your discussion with John, you spoke about your aspirational sense of gender, where the relationship between you and the world could develop in an ongoing way, in a platonic kind of way, that you would learn more about yourself, reflect it back upon the world, and learn about the world of gender and reflect it back into myself. And I'm wondering if you could take us through a bit of that. What was that process like? What did you do? How did you go about doing this? That might be a difficult question to answer, but
Yeah, it's really tricky, but I think a lot of it was in relationships with other people specifically, where, I would, I would present more, feminine, in society and, get positive feedback in some regard based on that, where people were, interacting with me in a way that made more sense to me. Um, like in a more, I guess how you would typically say how someone would interact with a woman. Um, and it was like, oh, this really fits. This really makes sense. I can roll with this. And so then it seemed to open up more capacities within me to then respond, in a more beneficial manner toward others from that. So, being perceived as a feminine person gave me the options to act more as, appropriately as a feminine person in the world. And I think, based on what others have told me, that this has been more appropriate overall. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback that, again, was it gender transition or was it, the wisdom cultivation aspiration? I don't know, but a lot of people have kind of, seconded that and reflected that, oh, I seem to, have my shit more together, so to speak. Um, and I seem to be, able to ask the right questions of people, able to take care of things better, that sort of thing. Hopefully that's not too vague. I didn't have any specific incident in mind.
well, you spoke about how you used I don't know if is it a goddess, Quan Yin. Uh,
Yeah,
so how would
yeah.
you go, like, maybe you could describe just briefly who Quan Yin was and how you use that model in aiding your aspiration.
Yeah, sure. So John, talks about having these divine doubles or sacred second selves, um, as, maybe perhaps an indispensable part of one's aspirational journey, depending maybe on the person. Um, and for me, because I had this sense that gender transition would afford me a greater ability to express generosity, agape, compassion, um, and because I had it's some background in Buddhism, for a couple decades, that Quan Yin just seemed like the obvious choice for me, basically. Oh, she is the bodhisattva of compassion. And, I looked into her a little more, and um, I learned that one of the legends about her is that she was actually, you know, male, so to speak, insofar as a bodhisattva even has gender, but presented as male, as we would say, as Avalokiteshvara. And then in the Chinese legend that I heard, Avalokiteshvara, because he was so compassionate, he was overwhelmed with the suffering of the world, and broke into like 1,000 pieces. And then the Bodhisattva repair crew came along and said, "Oh, geez, we got to fix this one. We're gonna let's make it as a woman and see if that works better. Maybe she'll be able to hear all the suffering of the world." It's kind of, I guess it's a little bit like a Mother Mary sort of figure in a way, and that's definitely been the case. How it's been sort of described by, I think, Christian missionaries in Japan at one point. But she fit really well for me. It was like, oh, great, here's this symbol of Buddhist compassion who I can also have like a little transgender narrative with. I can aspire, use that figure to aspire toward, unlocking, I don't want to say unlocking my own potential because that sounds so cheesy, but, accessing this deeper sea of compassion, really, like that's not really particular to me. Which sounds kind of strange. I'm a non-theist, so it does sound weird to me, but that's the experience of it. I guess along with that deeper intelligibility.
And just
So
to,
she
yeah.
was
Oh, wait, go ahead.
really important. And like, to take one specific example, I go and get hair pulled out of my face for an hour and a half every week. It's called electrolysis. It's just a thing you do to remove your facial hair, and at least permanently. And so I'll just kind of do a little recitation before or after that. The suffering of others is like the suffering of myself, or my suffering is like other suffering. There is suffering and there is an end to suffering. And that's like, basically, I imagine Quan Yin when I say that, like this sense of the bodhisattva of compassion, who represents, the end of suffering in the Heart Sutra of Buddhism.
Well, and I was actually just going to ask, how did you do it in practice, and that's a great example there. Lynn has a question: are people in our LGBT community using pride part of the community as a bypass for aspiration and or a substitute for religion?
Oh, that's such a good question, to be honest. Like, and it's yeah, I was actually thinking about it during Pride Month this year because, I get why Pride is called what it is, because, people have been shamed and told they're worthless if they're, even if they're gay, oh, you don't have kids, so you're worthless, and that kind of thing. And I get why Pride is often used as like a counterpoint for that. But it just kind of doesn't fit right for me. And I do think like aspiration, or something along those lines would be a better, term. I guess I wouldn't call it Aspiration Month necessarily, but something a little more catchy, probably. Um, but I definitely think in terms more of like, yeah, you're fit in the world, who you are. Maybe you need to process some shame. I definitely have. I wouldn't say I'm out of the woods either. Um, but that I don't think that just like throwing pride at it is going to fix it. And again, I think Lynn might be on to this point, that it's kind of, again, it's like a romantic quick fix, right? Not John's been careful lately to say degenerate romantic, but it's kind of like, oh well, I'll just project pride out there, and then things will be fine. And I'm like, I don't really feel that way. I don't feel like I could have just been like, well, now I'm proud. It was really more, I needed more understanding of myself. I needed to really grow into this person that I could be. It wasn't just like, oh, just now you're happy with yourself. Just, sort of like put a mask on it.
Well,
So hopefully
John,
that answers
yeah,
the question.
yeah, and Lynn, you can ask a follow up if you'd like, and you can come on. I know you're nervous about trying the buttons, but we can
Oh,
work
the
through that.
buttons, yeah.
The buttons, but I can send you an invite if you'd like to come on. Just let me know. Um, John talks about the four P's. So the four types of knowing: the propositional, prospect, propositional knowing, perspectival knowing, participatory knowing, and I'm always forgetting one of them.
Yeah, the perspectival.
Perspectival knowing.
Or did you say that one already? Sorry.
I might have, but I always miss a few. And in your talk with John, I got the sense that you thought, in the public eye, there's quite a bit of the propositional discussion about gender issues, but not the other three P's. Is that correct? And maybe you could elaborate on that.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it ties really into, again, back to aspiration. I think that aspiration is fundamentally participatory at its root. And I feel like that is where dysphoria hits you, when you feel like you are not fitting right. The metaphors I used before I knew about John's work were always about collision, sheet metal scraping I mentioned, dull metallic thuds in my being, this kind of like, just like like a hitch on a car that's not fit right, or something like that. It's just making a lot of noise and causing stress through the whole system. I really feel like that is where the issue is, and that's why aspiration for me was a necessary, really at least overwhelmingly helpful approach, because to aspire to something you have to have the real potential to achieve it. You can't aspire, to something that's not there. But it's also at a deeper level than just like, oh, well, I'm just gonna change my propositions about something. I'm gonna, replace shame with pride, for instance, or I'm gonna, revise my views on things to now say that, instead of a man becoming a woman, it's always a woman who is a woman, and that kind of thing. Not to, I might sound kind of dismissive of other people's viewpoints right now, and I don't mean to be, because people do have that deep sense from early childhood in some cases that like they were in the wrong body. But again, I think in the wrong body, your participatory being is fraught with this collision.
Do you think that some good could be done in the public discourse by bringing this out? Do you see a way forward for that, or is it too messy right now?
Oh boy, good question. I looked at it. A lot of people have said when are you writing a book? And if more people knew about this approach, or your philosophy on things, there wouldn't be as much of a battleground. And I get that, and I do think there's possibility there. And I don't want to say that wouldn't be something I would do. I much prefer the one-on-one approach, because to be honest, I feel like the meaning crisis is far more important than transgender issues. Mm-hmm. It's overwhelming, and I would like to talk about people in this context, in a way where we're thinking about all of these things in the wider context, because wisdom is obviously such a greater aspiration than than anything I could think of personally, and more open-ended. So, it's hard for me to think well, I will, it almost seems like a sidetrack in a way, but also in a more personal context, you can talk to people and both kind of develop wisdom around the subject of gender, maybe, or at least get some new perspectives on it. So that's where I like to hang out personally, is in the more, back and forth relational dialogues.
Have you faced pushback from people from any community on your approach?
Partly because I don't stick my neck super far out, I haven't gotten a ton. I actually thought I would get more pushback from the LGBT community, because my ideas are not, they don't fit as neatly into a box that you can then fight back against, transphobia or homophobia or something. I just don't have that in me. So I felt like I was going to get a lot after the video with John, and if I did, I didn't hear about it. The thing that's happened the most is that people just don't quite get it, and so I'm still kind of working at figuring that out. Like I'll talk about, for instance, how, people say, well, clothing has no gender. And then other people will say, well, clothing is gendered, you know? And I'm like, well, both of these statements seem like they're kind of missing something here because clearly our culture holds clothing to have gender in some ways. It's obviously malleable as well. For some people, it seems more important than others, etc. And so I'll kind of explore it like that. Like even on Facebook, I'll just kind of put out there my thoughts as I'm having them, which I get is kind of a strange thing to do. But people will kind of come back and they'll be like, yeah, it always seemed like clothing didn't have gender to me. Totally, I agree, or whatever. Like they'll just kind of take whatever they want out of what I say and, appreciate that side of it. I guess confirmation bias, sort of, or just not getting the nuance of it, where I'm trying to point to like this is not opening up enough. Again, this is like it just irks me all the time when I hear people say those simplistic, encapsulations of things like that.
Yeah, and it seems to be getting. I mean, that seems to be the majority of of the discourse sometimes. Yeah, I guess it would be nice if we had a different way, but I hear what you're saying in that it's only part of the. It's one small part of the meaning crisis. So you talked about transjectivity with John. Now, I'm wondering if you could start off by describing how you applied transjectivity to your transformation, and then how you also apply that to your greater wisdom journey, if that makes sense.
Oh boy, yeah. Yeah, again, we're talking like, I feel like in the greater wisdom journey, I'm sort of like packing my bag right now. It's like the stage of the process that I'm
we
at.
all are. That's that's what this community is all about. Is
That's wonderful.
Packing our bag and setting out on this journey. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. It's like so refreshing to like find a group of people that's like humble enough to just be like, okay, what's going on? What can we do about it? Yeah, it's great. So as far as John's idea of transjectivity really, really just for me fit gender transition like so well, along with aspiration. Like aspiration is also, rooted in transjectivity. But I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. Again, like, there's the romanticist sort of viewpoint of a subjective truth, and then there's this objective, so-called objective empiricist viewpoint, maybe, and I kept seeing flaws in all of those approaches, all those folk epistemologies around gender, I guess, and I was really like, no, there's something about it that's transjective. There's something that is between me and society. It's not in me. It doesn't inhere in me. It's not inherent in society. There's obviously a two-way street here where society is providing some kind of constraints and individuals are providing, other kinds of like, personal experiences or innovations or whatever. And it feels to me way too much like society and the individual have this ongoing relationship around gender rather than, any like supreme answer about gender that people, there's a man and a woman and, that's what there is. And this is what a man does and this is what a woman does, and that kind of thing. For instance, there's a lot of views, not to pick on anyone in particular, but a lot of views that I'm like, I just don't see that. Of course, that one in particular for me doesn't fit very well. But I think transjectivity just gave me a wider lens to view things. I mean, that concept I just really love it. As far as concepts go, it's up there with relevance realization, and I don't know, it just has like made me feel like, it simplified things in a way, and it brought back the wonder and the complexity of things as well. So, I feel like I am somewhat able to accept the knowledge that I've gleaned around transjectivity from gender transition over, toward a wisdom aspiration. And that was one of the things that I was so excited about, was that, you can kind of take just the process of aspiration from one aspirational journey to the next. And I definitely feel like, if one thing is if one simple concept is gonna clarify things for us, it's gonna be transjectivity. Like, at least that's true for me. Like, it's just been like, oh, like I don't have to have this burden of deciding that I'm subjectively expressing myself in the world, or that I know the absolute truth about something. When it comes to like issues of human meaning in society, like I can really swim with it, which it's been so helpful for me to not take things personally as well, to not be, since I'm not laying a claim to like purely objective truth. I don't have to like defend it as well. It doesn't, I don't get injured if someone says, like, well, you're just a man playing, you're just a grown-up man playing with makeup or whatever. I'll get those kind of comments from people sometimes, and I'm like, that's because I don't feel like I have to philosophically like come up with some kind of neat little picture. Then I can kind of like, I don't love to hear those things, but it's a lot less damaging.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, and I imagine there's been some. It can be difficult to be trans in this world, so I imagine you've had to participate in some uncomfortable experiences. But I won't ask you to go through those here. But what I'd like to ask is, so you've been going through this transition, and you've talked about the transjective nature, and you've talked about, I guess what you seem to be describing to me is coming out of modal confusion. Would that be fair to say? Do you see it that way?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. How do you mean? I think I kind of.
Well, you talked about the grip and the how you fit, your fittedness to the world, and I think John talks about modal confusion.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about he talks about it in the having and the being mode, but also when you don't fit. If you're the tennis player in a football field, there's modal confusion.
Yeah.
You don't feel you're not fitting to the environment or even to yourself, really. And this transition, the way you're describing it, seems to be a form of modal confusion, and that you're resolving.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I could totally see that. And like, it fits with like, oh, if only if I had the right propositions, I would be, able to successfully transition, or if only I could have the right procedures for doing makeup, if only I could get, the right surgeries, then I would be the person I need to be. Definitely I've thought about, the having mode in those senses before, when I've been watching, other people's transition journeys, and kind of getting the impression that there was something missing as far as the inner work required, where it was like, oh, if I only, not to be, too blunt, but only if I have boobs and a butt, and I'll be fine. That's it. That's all I need. I don't need to like sense how my body is experiencing this. I don't need to like, understand how my values might change through this process, how I might change, and yeah, that's definitely much more of a being mode process at its core. Obviously, there are having elements to it, but at least in our culture, and I guess in some other cultures, you could be, a third or fourth gender without having to go through surgeries, or, get all this expensive medical treatment. So it would depend on the culture again. But I think that it far outweighs it for me. That's totally true. And I think that's where that's where the real gold is, when you feel this sense of like, oh boy, like realization of self in the world, and that your interactions with others are going more smoothly and effectively as a result. But it's coming from this like pleasure, this deep, pleasure of fitting, rather than making it happen. It's truly a beautiful thing.
Well, I'd like to pick up on that. We do a lot of circling type events here, where we talk about, or we try to talk about how you feel during your experience, more than just going through the experience. How does it feel to go through a transition like this? If you can put it into words, I know that's
wow, yeah. There are, there's a dysphoria I talked about, the negative aspects I went into. I think I should probably cover the positive, side of it as well. And There really is like a feeling to me of magic, which is hard to express, but it was almost like I had this image of like these like glowing lights appearing in what was formerly this like mysterious, gloomy, dark fog, like somewhere in my being. Um, and it had that feeling had been with me my whole life, the gloomy dark fog, this kind of like I don't really fit, I don't know what I'm doing in society, I don't know who I am. I don't seem to like I seem to be kind of an outsider all the time, but not really an outsider, just kind of, this ongoing sense of not belonging. That was one of my first personal Zen koans that I had to work on was belonging. And it really like clarified into this like, oh, there's a whole bunch of this, not all of it, but a whole bunch of this was circulating around the issue of gender. And it felt like this really like magic is probably the best word for me. This sense of like, oh, there's an aliveness here, there's an in-tuneness, there's something that I have to be in touch with that put a heavy I can't be heavy-handed about it because if I am, it kills the sense of magic. So I have to kind of follow this progression where it leads to some extent um, inwardly. And I guess that would be like, not relying too much on self-defining, like, oh, my gender is this, I am this now, I'm going to be this way, but just kind of trying as best I can to let it unfold. That was always the way that it kind of fostered the feeling of magic that was like a really like an inner glow for sure. I think that was one of the main. I think that's like, as far as the happy side of things, the gender euphoria as people call it. That's really, really what I loved about that process.
And you also talked about having mystical experiences, and I got the sense from your talk with John that you'd had more than one. You described one on the podcast, but what is a
Yeah.
mystical experience to you, and how have they affected you?
Oh boy. Yeah, to me, right? Okay, good. That's a lot easier. So, for me, anything that really, an experience that is like not normal reality, but it shakes up my normal reality, shakes up my being, um, and must be dealt with, I think, for me, in a uh, responsible way. You must respond to it in order for it to be positive. Like otherwise, for me, it will fade away or it will have negative impact. Like especially if I get too sucked into the experience itself, the bliss of it or whatever, it can be very detrimental. When I was younger, I had some of those experiences and I just was not prepared and I wasn't mature enough to handle them. And so, um, this one happened to be more recent, and it definitely was one of the things that triggered the gender transition process for me because it was like starting to become apparent that for me gender transition would help me realize the potential of compassion, of this kind of simple generosity, like not like being a great person or anything, but just like, oh, someone needs something, you give it to them, like very, in that very natural participatory sense.
And so you've talked about this whole process, and you've talked about this change. Do you see the world differently? You've talked about how you are different, but is the world different to you now than it was prior to your transition?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I would say so. I'm thinking back, and I kind of neglected when I introduced myself it's hard for me to overstate the impact that bullshit has had on my life. I'll get to your question here, but I feel like I really succumbed to a lot of bullshit. Pseudo-religious ideologies, bullshit within the massage therapy profession, within the martial arts traditions. And part of what brought me to John was like, how did how did I get here? You know, like how did I fall victim to it so much? And in what's happened is that the world has has sort of opened up away from my concepts of things. So I feel like the world is more of a living thing to me in general. I am much less motivated by like socio-political ideologies than I was, because I'm just like, well, things are more complex, and there's people are complicated, and to get to know an issue is really hard, and it like I'm seeing the world in that way as a more complex, living thing, so to speak. Whereas before, it was always like I was looking for, on some level, like the answer, even though I told myself I wasn't that kind of person who was going to be, looking for the big capital A answer. But there was definitely much more insidious bullshit happening. And I think part of that was based on like a simplistic propositional conception of the world that just didn't let it breathe as much as it does now, at least.
And we're approaching the hour, but just to end off, you talked to John about uh, the the idea of a dojo. How do you see a wisdom dojo, and what something like that could be?
Yeah, that is a real fascination for me. So my current martial arts teacher had expressed at one point, like he wants people to have what he called enlightenment experiences without dogma. So whatever, I wasn't sure exactly what that means, but I think I get kind of the idea of what he's after. And so I've been thinking about how do you optimize a martial arts system for the cultivation of wisdom, for meaning in one's life. Not necessarily to provide enlightenment experiences, because you start to like try to do that to people, and then maybe you get into some trouble, like I was talking about earlier, if you push too hard. Um, I don't want to create, a religion out of a martial arts system necessarily, but to figure out what it can do for people in terms of cultivating wisdom, what it's doing well already, reverse engineering it, to maybe optimize that, and maybe try to fill in the gaps where it's not functioning well for people, or just to say, this isn't going to work well, for this area. This is going to have to be something that people would find outside of this system. So I'm working with John directly. I'm asking him tons and tons of questions on how the current system that I'm within, could be optimized in a dojo to facilitate that, and like what maybe practices we could add in. Maybe there's something analogous to circling. There's definitely something analogous to warm data labs that we're doing already, as I discovered. In our dojo. So,
And just for
like,
what's warm data labs for those who don't know?
oh yeah, Warm Data Labs. It's Nora Bateson's project. I don't know a whole lot about it, but when I heard about it, she's talking about groups of people circulating in a room, talking about related subjects, kind of moving from group to group, and then, my understanding, some kind of like collective intelligence, more like right brain style intelligence, developing. Out of that. And what we do in our karate martial arts school is little groups of students will be working on applications of different movements in forms, martial arts forms, and um, going from group to group, kind of like changing it up, giving out different ideas, testing them out, experimenting, and it develops this, not only the sense of like collective intelligence, but also like a sense of connection within the community that's less hierarchical than you would find in many martial arts, traditions, so to speak, which are not always all that traditional, it turns out. But we are, working on like, okay, what other things can we do like that? I'm interviewing all the black belts in our school to find out, what martial arts has done for them, and can we find something more like, this warm data lab? This is like a great way possibly to develop wisdom, but through the context of martial arts, and not directly, be looking at the sun, so to speak.
And is this a project that you're is this you're just thinking about, or are you really putting this into effect? This wisdom dojo.
Right now, I'm collecting information. I'm talking to all the black belts, interviewing them, getting their take on things. I'm going to start my own little local school here pretty soon, in conjunction with the two other schools that my teachers teach at nearby. So we haven't, I haven't done a lot of applying this stuff yet. I'm still really looking at, okay, like talking with John, especially, like what do we have? What are we missing? How does massage, the massage therapy style that we have in our system, potentially fit into this, etc. So there's a whole lot to think about, in terms of what's happening already. And I definitely don't want to like, squash any flowers underfoot while I'm trying to plant a garden.
So maybe further down the road you can come back and tell us all about this system if you get it going. That would be really interesting. And I just want to thank
Wonderful.
you. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for coming by today. I think this is really interesting. I think there's a lot of stuff to think about in terms of aspiration and the wisdom journey. And I thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you for the questions. Those were really, really helpful. And I feel like I learned something in the process as well.
And of course we have a heavy focus on an ecology of practices here. So if you have ideas or for practices that we can do here that you think would be great, we'd love to have you share them with us. And I know you've spent some time in the forum, so I'd love to have you engage with us. But this has been fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for coming by. Do you don't have a website or anything that you promote, or do you did you have a web list or?
Point no, the only way really to get a hold of me is bodydharma@gmail.com. So that's BODYDHARMA martial arts, all one word, at Gmail. And I just kind of set that up to start to talk to people. I'm talking to one guy from Norway already, who's trying to do something similar to me, influenced by Vervaeke's work. So um, we're just percolating a little bit.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and I hope to have you on again, and hope to see you around the Discord if you so choose. And I want to thank everyone for being here and listening and asking some great questions. And we'll have more Q&As to come. So everyone, please stay tuned. And we have a Google Calendar. You can the link will be below on the YouTube that you can see all the events that we have, and we have a lot of this is the kind of stuff that we discuss all the time around here. So we'd love to have more participation from people involving John's work, the meaning crisis in general, and anything meaning adjacent. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Rachel, once again for a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Brett.
Have a great day.
You too.